They were basically given the chance to learn to read and write, but no higher education. They were put to work as cheap labor. The children, the girls as domestic servants, the boys working as field hands, and it was to create like an permanent underclass, and that's still the effect in the Aboriginal world today. You asked earlier, how is it still going on? Well, I work in an area in Vancouver called the Downtown East Side. It's one of the poorest areas of Canada. It's over half the people who live there are Aboriginal, and they die at a rate 20 times the national average. It's not uncommon to see people die in their 30s and 40s from diabetes, from suicide, from violence. All of this, if you look at the people who are suffering, all of them went through these residential schools. They were terrorized from a young age, brutalized. I mean, some of the things going on in there. They had electric shock torture chairs they set up. They had sterilization programs where and this has already been the subject of lawsuits. They had hospitals operated on the West Coast where they would sterilize thousands of Native children as soon as they reached puberty. It was in order to exterminate the population, to get Native people off the land and depopulate areas that the whites wanted, especially the areas that were very had a lot of resources.
Oh yeah,
the lumber and the minerals and the fisheries. Definitely, they were targeted for that, and so this was all part of kind of a bigger plan of really ethnic cleansing.
And this, as we said there, this has been, pretty much, I guess, going on since day one, since the European came to, over to the American continent, basically, and this has just continued. And now the connection here between, let's say, the residential school system over there in Canada, then, is there any kind of clear connection between that and what the United Church is doing? And also, if you can for us, explain a little bit about the United Church. Is that a Catholic Protestant branch? What is it?
No, it's the biggest Protestant church in Canada. These boarding schools were run by all the main churches. The Roman Catholics ran about 2/3 of them, and then the United Church ran the rest, along with the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And those three churches are responsible for most of the residential schools. The United Church played a big role because it was set up by the government as part of their plan to kind of assimilate the immigrant population. Like after World War I, a lot of people were coming from Europe over to Canada, and the establishment here was very concerned that they were going to get swamped by all these, foreign populations, and they considered Native people as in the same category as immigrants. They were like a foreign population that had to be controlled, and that was one of the purposes of the United Church, to go into these areas, and what they called mission work was actually identifying the traditional leaders and wiping them out. Like often what missionaries would do is literally with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, they would go into the houses of the traditional chiefs and throw them out, evict them. Then they would bring in Christian Native chiefs and they would replace the traditional chief.
Really?
And, yeah, I mean that happened all over the country. And the families targeted for sterilization were usually the traditional chiefs who didn't want to go along with the church and the government. They were literally wiped out. And so a lot of the chiefs today are not actually the original chiefs. They were brought in. They were kind of like the collaborating, like you get in any system of colonialism. You had a certain group of people collaborating, and they were the ones who were elevated to positions of authority, and they're the ones actually who are running a lot of the Native groups in Canada today. So it's that whole legacy of colonialism that we're dealing with.
My God, it's an incredible story. And, you mentioned before here the Indian Act of Canada. And as far as I understood it, while watching your film, of course, says that the Indians have a legal status of a child or even a mentally ill. Is that correct?
That's right. There's the Indian Act. If you look at the wording, right in the preamble, it says, and this was an act brought in 1874 and has never changed, really. It's still in effect. And it says, Indians are legal wards of the state in perpetuity, which means until the end of time. And a ward of the state is you can't handle your own affairs. The government appoints a ward to act on your behalf, so you can't go to court. You're not considered a legal entity. You can't open a bank account, and none of that. So under the Indian Act, that's the status of Native people. And, as such, they can treat Native people any way they like.
Yeah.
A perfect example of that is recently the government's been, because of a lot of the work I've been doing, this information is finally coming out, and so the government was forced to, last year, not only acknowledge the high death rate, but start issuing what they call compensation to, financial compensation to survivors of these death camps, really,
Yeah.
called residential schools. And they're only offering $10,000, if you can believe it. $10,000 to a survivor is all they get. And they have to prove they went to a school. Well, how many people can do that? How do they have access to that paperwork? Most people have been disqualified because they can't prove they went to a school. Elsewhere, when the churches are sued for sexual abuse, like in the United States, the survivors are getting $1-2 million compensation. But in Canada, a Native person is worth 1% of that, and they know they have to take it because there's no way legally they can say to the government, no, I'm not going to, because they're wards of the state. So they're really in a dilemma, and it's interesting that I believe that after World War II, the United Nations actually banned race-based legislation, which is why the apartheid regime in South Africa was condemned, because you can't bring in laws aimed at a particular group to the exclusion of others, because that's an element of genocide. Yet the Indian Act is still in effect. How is that allowed to happen when, the United Nations supposedly spoke out, banned that kind of legislation?
Yeah, there you go. It's a big hint there in a way. As far as I see it, I see personally that this is something that expands and kind of permeates in through many countries, and that this is a system basically coming from the British. We can try to tie it back to the British Isles. And one of the things about the origins of this, if we talk about the Indian Act of Canada, of course, you mentioned something in the film called the Bago Commission that is created by the Vatican back in, I think, 1845, the Gradual Civilization Act. Tell us about that, if you will.
Yes. Well, that's why definitely the British played a big role in this. My relatives are from Ireland, and I've seen the effect of the same policies happening in Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, where they, were trying to basically wipe out the indigenous culture and language, and so it certainly was not unique to Canada, but it's even older than the British Empire. It really originates in Christendom, in the Roman Catholic Church.
In Rome, yeah.
The Bagot Commission was actually, the attitudes that were there were actually very old, and in fact, you can trace it right back to a thing called the Romanus Pontifex, which was a law brought in the 1450s by Pope Nicholas, and he basically said in that law, a papal bull, Christian kings have the moral duty and the right to subdue all non-Christian. They call them Saracens and pagans. And the reason they had the right to do that is because non-Christian people do not have the right to their own land and their own identity because they're not Christian. And that law has never been revoked by the Vatican. A series of laws, including the Intercaetera Bill of 1493, that divided the world between Spain and Portugal, the entire world. And all of those laws are still in the books in the Vatican, and the attitudes behind them are still in place too. The attitude is, I think the idea has been secularized now into a more kind of corporate capitalist model that anybody outside our system doesn't have the right to remain themselves. They have to be absorbed into our system or destroyed. And that was the attitude behind Christian genocide in the New World, and it's still the attitude, behind imperialism today, that people don't have the right to hold on to themselves. They have to be part of our system, or they're fair game, if you like. So, that's an old idea.